Moving on with generics, I'd like to show another example of a built-in method that we use all the time if you're manipulating the DOM, document.querySelector. This is a function, or a method, that in TypeScript accepts a type. You can actually see in this definition here, if I hover, it says it's a method, query selector, and then we've got those nasty angle brackets for a generic, and we can provide a particular type to it. So let me show you an example of why you would do this. Let's go to my HTML page, which right now, index.html, it only serves to include a script so that I can see whatever I'm printing out. Right now I'm not printing anything, but if I were, it would be printed out. But let's add on, how about an input, a text input, and it'll have a placeholder called, I don't know, how about username. You put your username in there, and then we want to do something with that input. So here it is, right? Auto refresh. Here's my username input. And I want to add an ID to this or a class. Let's go with an ID. Let's just call it username. Okay, so I've got this input, and from my TypeScript file, I want to be able to get a value out of this input or change the value of this input. I want to manipulate it. I want to, manipulate the DOM. So I obviously could use getElementById, but in this example, I want to use query selector. We've already seen getElementById, but let's use query selector. And query selector accepts a CSS style selector. So I'm going to use the ID symbol, right? The hash sign, and then username. Okay, so that is my CSS style selector, and that hopefully will select this element, right? All right, so then the next step is I'm going to save that to a variable. We'll call this const input element, or sure, input L equals that. Now, what is the type of input L going to be? It says, TypeScript says, that's of type generic element. Generic there, that was a bad choice of word. How about just plain old element? Nothing specific, right? There's a million types of these elements that we could have. We have an HTML input element, HTML form element, button element. Instead, query selector doesn't know. It just says, all right, you're either going to get some basic element, that's all that I can tell you, or null, because it might not be found, right? So let's say that we find it. Let's just console.log what we found, input L. Take a look over here. Null. Why did that happen? Well, that actually is my fault. That was a stupid error. I included my script too soon. All right, let's try that again. There we go. We found it. It's printed out. And I'm actually going to use a console.dir so that I can just see the whole object. Okay, so there it is. Input, that's the element, and it has a whole bunch of properties. So one of those properties that we expect to find on an input element is the value. Value, right, is what we can use to control what's in that input. So I could do something like, if it's my cat, Blue Steel 345. From the HTML side of things, I changed that value. But if I want to change it or retrieve it from JavaScript or TypeScript, I could do something like input L dot value. But it doesn't look like that's going to work. I'm not getting an autocomplete. But I'm telling you right now, and hopefully you have some experience with the DOM and selecting elements, an input element, which is what this is, has a value property. And I should be able to work with that. But I'm not. Right? There's no value there. If I try and set it equal to something like something stupid like hacked, well, it's going to complain and say property value does not exist on type element. All that TypeScript knows is that query selector is going to return element or null. Element is the most basic DOM element, the most basic type of object that we could get back. But we know more about this element. We know that it's supposed to be a form input or an input element. So what I can do is provide inside of our little angle brackets a type. An element here, I'll say HTML input element. And query selector is set up in such a way, it's a generic function, that it will accept a type, and then it will use this and return to us something of this type. So now if we look at input L, it says, okay, that's either going to be an HTML input element or null. And of course it could be null because maybe I misspell it, maybe that element's not there, in which case it will be null. So we're going to get an error now saying object is possibly null, right? And you can't access value directly on that. So then I have a couple of choices. And the easiest option is just to add an exclamation point. And we talked about this earlier, saying this is definitely not null. And now it says input element is of type HTML input element. So I now should have access to value, which exists on any HTML input element, and I can change it to be hacked, and it does work. So that's coming from JavaScript, right? That hacked is from here. It originally starts out by having a value of bluesteel 345. So that was a long explanation to prove that query selector is a generic function that accepts some type inside. Let's do one more quick example. Let's add in a button this time that has a class of .btn, and it just says click me, right? Okay, so if I want to use query selector to select this by its class, which again is btn, whoop, I shouldn't have a dot in there. The class name is btn. Over here, I can do a document.query selector and then say select something with the class of btn. We use the CSS syntax, so we need that dot or the period there, and we'll call this btn. All right, so query selector in this situation right now, again, it's just going to return to me something of type plain old element. So not a button element, not an input element, not a form element, just plain element or null. And I haven't provided a type to it. The default type for this generic is of element, and we've seen that already. But I know more about this element. I know that it's supposed to be an HTML button element. So I can provide that in here, right, and say HTML button element. And now if I look at what the type of this variable is, it's either HTML button element or null because it might not exist. But if I put that exclamation point there, now that null part is gone. So I basically am telling this function what type I want it to return to me. I'm giving it an input type, and then it will return to me something of that type. And that's an example of a generic. So it doesn't really care. I mean, you have to pass in a valid type, but it doesn't care. It's not saying here's the two types I work with. We can give it some type, and then it will return an element of that type. And that's that relationship that is really important. We give it some input type, and we can expect some output type. And we can control that return type by providing this input type inside of angle brackets. So it's not an argument to the function itself, right? We're not passing it in here, but you can kind of think of it as like a type argument. It's set up in a way that it's very generic. In the next video, we'll see an example of how we can actually write a function that behaves this way. How do we write our own generic function instead of just using an existing one? How do we write our own?